Do you want to go back to France, Bonbon? You're half French, aren't you? Yes, you are. Sally YouTube, coming in with a little bit more of a personal video this time, a little bit of an update as to where we're at and our thinking in the midst of this whole thing, pandemic, crisis, COVID, that has been obviously dominating the world for the past wee while, and how I am, how Niels is, and that kind of thing. I guess a question that we get quite a lot is, when are you going back to France? And it's hard. So for those of you who don't know, New Zealand has closed its borders, but like closed them to everyone except New Zealand citizens and permanent residents. And so you can only essentially come to New Zealand if you have the right to permanently live here. Either you're a permanent resident for life or you have a passport. And even if you are a New Zealand citizen or resident, except if you're coming from Australia or Cook Islands, that was quite recent, but if you're coming back from any other area of the world to visit family, loved ones, maybe for special events, anything like that, you need to go into managed isolation, which is government mandated 2 weeks in a hotel at your cost. So it's $3,100 for the 2 weeks as an individual, an extra $950 if you're a couple, so $4,050, and then an extra $500 or so for any kids you may have. And then on top of that, any New Zealander leaving the country by choice at this point to go overseas or go on holiday or visit loved ones or whatever that looks like, then coming back knowing that it was the COVID madness, like if you've left knowing the situation we're in right now, you also have to pay for the managed isolation or the quarantine as well. So what this means is that New Zealanders living overseas who have their lives, who have their jobs, who have potentially families, whatever that looks like, they can't come and visit loved ones, you know, sometimes loved ones who are dying or things like that, without paying the thousands of dollars on top of the airfares for this managed isolation. Like if they're here to visit and then go back to what they call home. And what it means for Niels and I is that we can't go back to France to visit and then come back without paying for the managed isolation. So we feel quite stuck because we were looking into it, and even though France is opening up its borders again to international travelers and even travelers who have been vaccinated and that kind of thing, so we're planning to get vaccinated in July, but even then we were looking at flights, and essentially it's a $12,000 project because the flights are ridiculously expensive. Can you imagine flying all the way from New Zealand to France right now? Like the cost of those flights, it's about maybe 3,000 euros each. And then on top of that, we would have to pay just over $4,000 to be in a hotel room for 2 weeks. And even though it may not sound like the end of the world, I think you'd have to do a pretty darn good job not to crack up, especially with Niels, who needs to exercise and do sport and like be very active every single day. But you know, essentially once every few days you get to book a slot to exercise. They take you to these fields or like gated pens in the middle of nowhere, and you can walk around. It's honestly like a prison, and then you get bussed back. You're getting swabbed and tested for COVID like every few days. You've got no control obviously over like, you know, the meals provided. You eat what you're given essentially. I'm sure you have maybe a slight choice between 2 options for certain meals, but it's really limited, and you've actually got no control over whereabouts in the country you go as well. So after, you know, big trip back from France, you're not necessarily going to stay in Auckland where you land. Their places may be full. You might have to go to Hamilton or Rotorua or, you know, somewhere else as well. So it's quite the process. And it's not just the flights and managed isolation costs that hold you back, right? Like $12,000, it's horrendous. Could we make it if we pulled everything we had, potentially like asked family for a short-term loan or whatever that looks like? Yeah, we could make it. we could make it, but it's the logistics on top of that as well. So the spots in managed isolation are booked out for 4 to 6 months in advance. And the thing is at the moment is that flights are very unstable and can be cancelled very easily at any moment. And so if your return flight gets cancelled and you have to give up your spot in managed isolation, there is no guarantee that you'll be able to rebook for a date that suits you for a return flight. And if you do not have your voucher, your ticket for managed isolation, you cannot enter the country.
I'm done.
And so there's a lot of sort of uncertainty around it as well, and a lot of juggling. We may be stranded over in France for longer than expected based on the situation, flights getting cancelled, having no spots in managed isolation. It could end up being an incredibly expensive and complicated scenario. And so this uncertainty and the cost and the experience of being in this dimly lit hotel room for 2 weeks upon our return, and then having to get back home, and all of that kind of stuff just sort of adds up to us feeling so stuck right now. Like, we really do feel a little bit trapped in New Zealand. And this is coming from a place of being like, we're so lucky to be in New Zealand, to be living completely normal lives, no masks, no worries about COVID, being able to do whatever we want and go wherever we want in the country. We acknowledge that. We feel really grateful for that, and we know that it's been really hard over in France, and it's not the France that we left, right? But it's going to be quite a shock going back and having to wear masks, just seeing how things have changed. And so we get that, but at the same time, can you imagine feeling so far away with very, very limited options? It's like you have basically no options. The one option you have is pretty crap in the grand scheme of things. And it's almost like the worst thing that could happen. It's like, I remember when we were leaving France, firstly, we promised we'd be back every single year. And obviously, for reasons outside of our control, we haven't been able to meet that promise. But not only this, the big fear anyone has when they're moving that far away from home is, what if something important happens? What if someone falls ill? What if you need to get back home? What if there's an emergency? And we always said, yes, we're far away, but at the end of the day, if we need to, it's 24 hours, it's 30 hours, and we'll be there, you know? And there's just this awful feeling that no matter what happens, and I know we're not the only people in this situation in the world, like, I'm not that egocentric, but it is a heavy feeling knowing that whatever happens, you have to kind of accept the fact that you're not going back, you can't make it. So I think what's really tough about the New Zealand situation in particular is that there's no communication on when things will change, when the borders will open. Like, even if you're vaccinated, you go into managed isolation, you pay, you are in that hotel for 2 weeks. If people who are vaccinated could fly back into the country and self-isolate at home for 5 days, 10 days, without that cost and without that experience of having to do the isolation, I think we would go like that to France. But we don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. There's no date, there's no information that's telling us as New Zealanders, okay, so if you're vaccinated, this is when things will change, or this is when the borders might feel slightly more relaxed, or this is when vaccinated people from overseas, your loved ones in France, could come and actually visit you. Like, we have no clarity or information on that whatsoever. So it's been really tough lately, and Niels is feeling super homesick, and I don't blame him. We're coming up to our 2-year anniversary being in New Zealand, which is so hard to believe because it's been such a strange time. Life has been just felt a bit weird, you know, a bit strange, but it's been almost 2 years here, and he misses his dad, you know, he misses his family, his cousins. He wants to see his loved ones. He wants to see his grandma, who's not doing super well. And so there's not much to say about it, apart from the fact that we're anxiously waiting for news to see when things might change for the borders. I think it's really harsh on expat New Zealanders who don't want to move back but just want to come and see loved ones. I think it's really harsh on New Zealanders who have loved ones overseas. I understand it, I get it, but it's really tough right now, and it's very, very scary thinking that this could still be this way in 6 months, in 9 months, in a year, because we just don't know. They're just so strict about that border. They're not taking any risk, and it's going to get to a point where, you know, I know that they'll eventually let vaccinated people in, and we can expect occasional COVID cases. Like, the goal isn't for New Zealand to be COVID free forever, but for now the goal is to be COVID free, and it's a goal that's affecting a lot of people who have family overseas, and yeah, really not easy. So yeah, we've been feeling a little bit down, homesick, pretty desperate to get back to France, to be honest. What's cool is that Niels has a really awesome workplace, and I think if he asks them to, you know, be able to go over for a couple of months, maybe even 2 or 3 months, work from there a bit, but actually be based in France for a while when we do go back, I'm pretty sure they'd be open to that conversation, which is awesome to know. And obviously I can work from anywhere, so that's really cool. So yeah, just bring on New Zealand changing its border rules, or otherwise we might just have to get to a point where we're feeling really desperate and we're like, okay, let's go, let's do it, screw it, like, let's pay the money, let's do the thing. I guess the only thing about that is that the worst that could happen is that like 2 weeks later they announce, oh, it's over, we don't have to do that anymore, and you'd feel like a bit of an idiot, but at the same time, hey, you would have gone back, seen your family, it would have been worth it. So yeah, just a bit of a life update. So it's not necessarily like super peppy or bright and bubbly, but hey, sometimes life is that way. And yeah, my heart goes out to you if you're struggling or separated from someone you love as well during the COVID pandemic. And yeah, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Get your vaccination, and if not for you, get vaccinated for other people like us who need countries' borders to stay open and to be able to see our loved ones. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this episode. I'd be so happy to chat to you in the comment section below. Let me know what's on your mind, any reactions or thoughts to this discussion, and I'd love to learn more about your situations as well. And otherwise, thank you so much for chatting with me and being here, and I'll see you in the next Not Even French video. A bientôt!